everybody. Looks like we have a quorum for the TC DefCore Interlock about designated sections. And so if people could make sure you get your roll call information on the Etherpad that we built up. This Etherpad wasn't designed for this meeting, but it seemed like a good place to start. So we left it there. And then Josh and I had talked briefly yesterday about an agenda, but I wanted to review the agenda before we started. And then we can sort of go through. And if there are other items you want to put in here, please bring it up. Does that sound reasonable? Any objections? Cool. The other thing I'd note is that we're trying to keep this to an hour. I know everybody's running around and it's Friday, so we'll see what we can do. If we need to go over, we'll bring it up 15 minutes to the hour. So from an agenda perspective, what we want to do is offer a history lesson if people need it. That would probably take 5 or 10 minutes. Then talk about process to make sure that we actually do things in the right order. We've heard several times specifically that we want to answer the questions that were in the TC's response to designated sections the first time. Those are still lingering, so I want to, if nothing else, I want to exit this meeting with that. And then on the assumption that our process is defining principles, then talk about the designing principles, and then finally actually writing down what is a designated section, which I think everybody wants to do. And I would suggest that people who are prone to let their mind wander during the meeting, that we actually could, at the bottom of this document, have a section for what is a designated section. And if you find that a need to answer that question during this meeting, go ahead and get a running start on this, because I think that would be useful. That would be another great thing to leave this meeting with, is a definition of what a designated section is. So hopefully we'll go through that. Anybody comments, process? The agenda seem reasonable?
It looks reasonable.
Okay. Does anybody feel a need for a history lesson? I probably need to do one anyway, briefly, but
I've looked through a bunch of the old stuff, but it certainly wouldn't hurt me.
I would appreciate a brief one, yes.
I would as well.
Okay. I'm happy to do that, and let's start there. So, boy, we've been at this for quite a long time, starting all the way up to InkUp, which was the process by which the integrated.
Rob, it was way before InkUp, but
it was. I'm sorry. Yes, sorry. It's been going on forever, and even so, right? It's in the bylaws and as a necessary thing that we had to talk about. And what we did was, after a whole bunch of churning, we came up with a set of principles. This was at the result of hours and hours of meetings. Sometimes we call this the spider, because of where we started with all the pieces to it. And I would suggest that read this document, because the designated sections is actually specifically from this document. We usually use this cheat sheet, which makes things sort of simple. The core principles broke into three major components. One basically saying that we want to define core in a way that applies to the whole project. There's a side note that we recognize as after we've done that, we will probably have to have more specialized marks, but right now we're just trying to get a definition that everybody can use to say what is OpenStack. And it's very important, there's a commercial implication for this, so if you want to use the trademark as a commercial implementation, or a distro, or a cloud that's running OpenStack, or a product that's using OpenStack, we have to be able to tell you that you can describe it as OpenStack. So that sort of lays out the need. The next section down is the one where we're very focused. This is item 4, the designated upstream code. So the idea was that in defining core, we required people to use, if you want to use the OpenStack brand, we're an Apache license so people can do whatever they want, but to use the OpenStack brand, you must use some part of the OpenStack code. That could be one line. It could be every single thing we've ever committed, some amount of code is required to call yourself an OpenStack Cloud. You must use some code. You need to figure out what today. And then from there, we actually had 2 options. If you are using the designated section of the code, then we expect that the full function of the cloud will be implemented in an open way by OpenStack. There'll be a reference implementation. And we also expect that vendors or anybody else could substitute in those non-designated sections alternate implementations that would accomplish the same result as long as, and now we get into the next block, as long as they pass the tests that the reference implementations pass. And so the idea is that we have a community body of tests. Those tests can be remotely or self-administered. I'll pause for a second. We sometimes get trapped a little bit here. We are not trying to create a police state for OpenStack in this. I think it actually says that in the details. This is supposed to be a self-policed activity. You say that you're using designated sections. You say that you're passing the tests. It's so easy to validate most of those things. We're not trying to create another authority that says yes or no to this. If that's necessary, we'll do it, but for now we're making the assumption that people will comply out of community pressure, out of their own risk of getting caught. We're not trying to create a police state. That's number 8. So of those tests, we have lots and lots of tests. Not all of them would be required for core, so there needs to be a process by which we say some of those tests are the required tests and some are not. That's another part of the work we're doing, the RefStack work and a lot of the criteria scoring process that we're doing. That's a whole other conversation to pick those tests. And then if you pass all the must-pass tests, then you would be able to use the OpenStack brand. Josh, that's about as fast as I think I could go through it. What did I miss?
Well, so just to always emphasize, using the OpenStack brand in the world of DefCore, we're only dealing with commercial use of the mark, right? So there are the 3 different uses of the mark that are defined in the bylaws. There is the right for the community to call themselves OpenStack, which is non-commercial use and is widely protected. There is the right for the projects that are under development to use the OpenStack mark to talk about themselves, as long as the TC has decided they're part of the incubation to integration workflow, which was what the INCUP effort was about. And then there's the commercial use of the mark for things that are currently called either powered by or built for or OpenStack distro. And that is what the definition of core process is intended to protect. There may also be future marks that don't require designated sections at all, but all we're trying to deal with right now is the existing commercial marks and their use of designated sections.
Which brings up the boiling the ocean approach. We are intentionally boiling a pot of water right now. We know that there are other conversations that we are surfacing, and some of those we're very deliberately pushing down the field because they tend to make us loop, and we don't get consensus on it. So we've narrowed the field of discussion intentionally, and we will point that out if we start getting off field because it sucks up a lot of meeting time if we're not careful. Questions?
I think that's an excellent summary. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Okay. So we've had a lot of conversations with the TC now, and PTLs and on DefCore. Sorry, an Amber Alert in my area. Some of the things that we've talked about are using a set of principles, sort of stepping up to a higher level piece as a way to help define what we need for designated sections. Generally, that's useful to look at we sort of did a straw man as part of that. Are people interested in talking about the principles for designated sections, or do we want to talk about what a designated section is more clearly, or do we want to jump to the questions? I'm very open to flex on the agenda here.
I think it's very important to understand exactly what's meant by a designated section.
So I think the easiest way to go at that is with an example. And I know we glossed over this a bit in the history, but the reason we ended up with the term designated section was to avoid using the term plugin or implying anything about the technical architecture of the various projects. But as an easy example, Cinder has a bunch of code that is common to whatever storage backend you're using, and that code, exposes the APIs and deals with scheduling. And then it has a bunch of driver code, or what is characterized as Cinder driver code, that is specific to individual storage backends. And the thinking was that the API code and possibly the scheduler code would be a designated section, in that every OpenStack cloud that was claiming to run Cinder would need to be running that code. And by running, I don't mean just shipping it in their distro somewhere, but actually that was the code path that was executing to provide those capabilities as tested by ResStack, but that the driver code could be substituted for proprietary code or commercial code or open source code that wasn't in trunk, or any other variety of code that the vendor might decide was appropriate. There are folks who would like to see all of the code as a designated section and have a much more GPL-like experience, and there are folks who have argued that none of the code should be designated, and what's important is API compatibility. And the designated section concept that the board voted on was what we could get as a reasonable compromise to say some of this clearly should be common, and it would be best for OpenStack if the community all contributed to that common code base. Some of this is so specific to individual vendors and in fact touches on what might be proprietary code elsewhere, that we would have a chilling effect on the commercial ecosystem if we expected all of that to be upstreamed. And this does mirror a little bit the sort of universe repositories in the Linux world. As far as what we actually mean on a technical basis, again, Rob has emphasized that this is not audited. This is not intended to power some set of tests where we are checking. This is a self-certification effort with the big hairy stick of public shaming and possibly loss of the license if you're found to be violating it. So these are fairly rough guidelines to provide to a vendor to say, hey, we really think the code that provides the API should be a designated section, and anyone who's building a distro is going to be able to say, we get what that code path is. It's this thing with this whiskey middleware, and it's a best faith effort that if we're improving that, we should be submitting those patches upstream. And therefore, we're running code that is common with the rest of the community.
Right. And that's, I think, one of the driving elements of it, the cultural drive to encourage people to upstream code. Right.
Okay, Josh, thanks for that. As a follow-up, if you look on the wiki, the core definition page, sentence 6.13 says consumers must have a way to determine how the system is different from reference, either posted, discovered, or et cetera. My understanding is, to use your example of the Cinder drivers, And the point of Cinder, in a large part, is to abstract away some of the differences in drivers behind a common API. So therefore, the differences are not actually, it's not possible to discover that there is a different driver in there because it's using the same API. And in that sense, that's what you're going, for commercial use, somebody would say, hey guys, we're using Awesome plugin rather than the open plugin, and it's different, and we claim that it matches all the API functionality. You can use our same API, and that is sufficient in this case.
Yeah, so the 613 stuff is covering off two cases. One is the extensions framework, which does provide programmatic discoverability, right? You can query Nova and say what extensions are running. Give me a list of actions. And a lot of those extensions are very widely deployed, but were still built at a technical level as an extension to Core Nova, so floating IPs, for instance. This also maps to a bylaws requirement that the vendors always publish what version of the code of each of the core OpenStack components is included in their product. And so the goal is to say, I'm running Grizzly or Grizzly Stable as of, 2013.1 or whatever it is of Cinder and Nova, but I'm running Havana of Horizon, or whatever the mix and match may be. That's required to be available as part of documentation. This is intended to also elucidate that, to say your consumer has to have in their documentation or discoverable from the API to understand what is the back end, what are the drivers that they're actually using, whether it's a public cloud or a private cloud. Some of those drivers expose additional capabilities. And so we see cases where the consumer, it's kind of a right to know issue of, am I actually consuming capabilities that are beyond what I'm going to be able to get in other OpenStack environments, or am I consuming something that I can expect to be in all of the drivers? We see this with snapshotting and SYN provisioning and copy on write functionality in different Cinder backends. We might see this live migration support across different hypervisors. So that the goal of this, the interop side of DefCore, is that the end users have a way of understanding, these are the functions I'm consuming in this cloud environment. These are the ones that will be portable because they are OpenStack core, and these are the ones that may not be portable but may be commonly available. So, and do you see the issue we're trying to address there?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. What if those designated sections, or the non-designated sections, the replaceable parts, don't change the functionality, but are places where vendors can do functionality? I mean, for example, with Cinder, it doesn't really matter whether or not you're running on Seagate drives or WD drives.
It may, though. In a sense of, if Seagate has implemented an error checking method that means, according to Seagate's marketing literature, you never need to do snapshots because, there's some other error detection and you don't need backups. It's just going to be magically awesome for you. Then the consumer needs to know that they're being trained by their cloud provider to have a set of best practices that may not be the same against a separate API. And I think if the system is different from reference is really again, it's a best faith question that's back on the vendor. If you're picking a particular driver because you believe it's more awesome, the more awesomeness is a difference from reference. If it's not a difference from reference, you are not required to tell your consumer what driver you're using. I mean, let me use SDN as another example, right? Most of the SDN components, PlumGrid and Contrail and NSX, have additional APIs that are not exposed through Neutron that allow you to do other different things with your networks. And if those are exposed to the Neutron extension, that meets the 613 requirement. If they're not, it would need to be documented, because if folks are being trained to use those APIs and they're rolled up in the same dashboard, but they're not OpenStack, the users need to understand that that's a not OpenStack functionality they're not going to see elsewhere.
Right, that makes complete sense.
Okay.
So I want to make sure that we move through this to an extent, but also I want to try and be clear. What would help people understand designated sections from a definition perspective?
I had two questions about that. One has to do with the level of detail, and I think that's been answered pretty well based on these examples. But the other one is there at the bottom of the Etherpad about how tightly this is tied to the designation of which capabilities are going to be part of core. And the thing that made me raise that question was the comment under the rationale for Horizon saying that no part of Horizon is designated as core because we're not going to require that anyone use Horizon. And if we're really separating those two things, then maybe we should consider what parts of Horizon really are core, even if we're going to then say, well, you don't have to use that in order to use the mark.
So let me answer that one really.
Priority, we do that later. Going through each project seems fair.
Yeah, so the question around Horizon, I mean, the reality of how we're doing RefStack is we're relying on Tempest tests to determine capabilities. And it's because it's the only mechanism we have that is community-owned and can be applied evenly across both private and public clouds, which is one of the goals of the definition of core. And unfortunately, we don't have Tempest tests that exercise Horizon enough to measure the capabilities as being must-have. Now, that's not saying Horizon is never going to be core. It just means as of Havana, as of the stick in the sand we're working on now, we don't have enough test coverage. So the goal is not to say no designated section.
But hold on. I think this is, you're right to call this out. This is mixing the streams, and I actually would ask that we omit that statement because Josh is entirely right. There aren't enough tests to bring it in as a capability, but that's different than it saying what parts of Horizon are designated. That's a different question. And so I think you're right to say that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I was getting to that. The second part is the goal of ordering this. The goal of ordering this and saying let's define designated sections for the projects that look like they will have capabilities in core as of this first set of certifications is just so that we don't get swamped trying to do designated sections for every project.
That's
and it's not to say we don't need to define.
Yeah,
that's not saying we don't need to define. The expectation is many of these projects will probably have capabilities that end up in core in the future, and when that happens, we will need designated sections defined for those projects. We're just trying to sequence it so that we don't get swamped.
Sure. Okay. So let's say that, though, instead of we're not going to require Horizon without giving a reason why.
Sure. And I don't know who wrote that.
Yeah, no, I wasn't, I don't know either. I wasn't placing blame. Just,
okay.
It looks like it's been changed.
Yeah. I just updated it. Yeah. But I'm glad you pointed out because you're exactly right. We want to split ideally, our definition of designated sections is durable regardless of whether the code is core, the capabilities are core or not.
Yes. Can I ask a really
that is a note
question real quick? Just as a quick clarification, we are talking Havana, right?
We're talking Havana as of right now, and then a goal of having Icehouse certification done 90 days after the Icehouse release, and doing Juno certification concurrent with the Juno release. So by Juno, we should be doing, sort of real-time and continuous core designation.
Yeah,
right now we're trying to get Havana done.
I was purely asking because the list of other things and incubating down in the bottom was sort of a mixed Icehouse Havana view. So I thought if we're doing Havana, we should just clarify that thing. It's really, yeah.
I gotcha. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Good clarification. So do people feel like we have a better idea on what designated is? Because I just from a time perspective, I would love to see people editing this as we talk and not try and hammer it out as much in this meeting. I think we've got other topics to cover. But I'm happy to keep talking about it if somebody still says, it just doesn't make sense.
There is one clarification I wanted to add. I don't know if John Griffith is on the call, but in the Cinder section, there was some confusion saying API is a designated section. What I meant was the code that exposes the API, not API compatibility. So literally, the binary for Cinder API would be required to be shipped. Binary being the wrong term, but I think you get what I mean. And I know that's led to confusion and people thinking we're talking about API compatibility. In this case, we are always talking about sections of code that provide that API.
Right.
And that's worth clarifying designation.
Yeah, so when you say that, are we talking about defining what the designated sections are based on what the output, the binary, I think was your word, but what goes into that, or are we talking about listing files and things like that, or functions?
I would keep it, I would love to keep it at the module level. I think individual file, we don't want to be so prescriptive that this becomes onerous either on the TC or the PTLs or on the vendors. So we really need to be keeping this fairly lightweight and say, guys, you all know if you're doing the right thing or not. Right? If we're saying, hey, scheduler's designated section, that means if you're improving the scheduler, it needs to be upstream. I don't think we need to be saying this file and this file and this file and this file are or are not scheduler.
So that was the thing that clarified it for me at the last board meeting was originally it seemed like we were talking about like going through and making a taxonomy of like, methods and stuff like that inside of the code base, which is clearly insanity. So I think that the idea of calling it out at like big ticket items and then we can address it if something is an issue later on down the road sounds perfectly sane.
Yeah, and so I guess a point of clarification, are any changes to the designated sections allowed? Backports of bug fixes, I think, is a sort of a good example.
Yes, and so the goal in the core definition, and Rob, jump in here if I get this wrong.
Sure.
The alternate implementations. There's a piece here that says that the vendor basically needs to make a best faith effort to upstream those changes. They don't necessarily need to be successful, but they need to make the effort, and therefore that their extensions are available in open source. And this is really the grayest part of this definition, is saying, hey, I really needed to make some changes to the scheduler to deal with how we're dealing with multiple regions. I have tried to upstream this, but it is at odds with the way the TC is driving towards use of cells or use of resource groups or whatever. Therefore, there is this branch that's sitting in Garrett that was -1 and archived that represents my best faith effort. Probably this is irrelevant in 6 months when we're going to move to the next release anyway, so we're not going to fight over it, but the effort was made.
Yeah, and I think another thing to point out as a corollary of that is what you said earlier, which is that there is an amount of self-policing and we're letting people self-certify and use some judgment, right? So you probably know if you're running the Nova scheduler or not. If you patched a few files, you're probably still running the Nova scheduler. If you replaced it with something you wrote in Haskell, you're probably not running the Nova scheduler. And so I think
we have a really simple example at Piston, right? We worked on a patch with IBM to do multi-home routing in OVS, and it was abandoned upstream by IBM, and we couldn't get them to really help us land it, and it got messy, and we weren't super happy with it. We said, hey, we've been supporting this. It's in a branch, but it's not our go forward. We're now supporting, Contrail and PlumGrid and other commercial vendors. We're not going to fight with Neutron about trying to land that patch. But if somebody was really concerned about what was being run in a previous version of our software, it is upstream. You can go find it. And I think that's the level of best faith effort we're expecting from people. So
we're trying to incent upstreaming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. Ultimately, we didn't choose the AGPL for our license, so ultimately there's some freedom here, and that's I think in the community intentional.
Yeah, and which is why I make some of these designated section questions tricky. And the one in particular I wish John Griffith was here for is the Cinder scheduler, because he does have a really good point, which is that the Cinder scheduler has a multi-backend logic built into it, and he would like to see that scheduler was a natural designated section. But there is some logic to say, well, Serba has been looking at selling a commercial scheduler that would be a replacement to both Nova and Cinder scheduling, because it would be Nova and volume aware, which makes this problematic. So, I mean, I think there's a few of these that I'd love to kick off further discussion around, but I think in general the approach is about right, and I still think that vesting the responsibility to the TC and the PTL makes the most sense.
Yeah, because you can make the argument there too, that if we're talking about incenting upstream and we've got, the efforts that keep not getting off the ground upstream to get a unified scheduler, then, we trying to figure out how to, incentivize those folks to help make a unified scheduler that then they can plug into. I don't know, we can go down that rabbit hole really quickly.
So actually, you guys you're just on the edge of actually talking about the principles. And I would suggest that based on this, we jump over to the principles, because I think that you're basically talking through those points right now. Can we jump up to that?
Yeah, I'm just scared of attacking them. I mean, I think it's
this is a very fast straw man. So yeah, but.
So the thing about this that makes it tricky to address, which is why we're 4 years into governance and now wrestling with it, is because the details of this decision have impact on the technical decisions about the project, in the sense of which vendors are incentivized to work on which sections, but they also have business chilling impacts on which vendors can therefore engage in the commercial ecosystem or not. And I think Serba is a great example here. I think there are identity management providers that tuck into Keystone that are good examples. And so principles are tricky, because I don't want to define anything that restricts the scope of the PTL to say this is what we'd like to do that's best for the project. But I'm very concerned about the commercial impacts and the public and the user's perception of those commercial impacts, to say, well, does that mean that I'm never going to be able to use this commercial plugin with OpenStack because the vendor's never allowed to replace that piece of code, or they can't call it OpenStack and there's no other model.
That's actually the reason why I'm trying to switch us to principles, is because I think that the question you guys were talking around is, if a vendor says, I want to replace this part of OpenStack because I have another way to do it, that to me might indicate that the code is not designated. This isn't black or white, but if a vendor's saying, I have a substitute scheduler like what you're describing, then the code they're trying to replace, we should be asking, is it really designated? That's what you see and that's why that's principle to me number 4.
Do you have a numbered principle somewhere? I'm lost.
I do. Top of the document, line 28.
Oh, sorry. I found those so confusing I couldn't read them.
Sorry. Well, fix that.
They look like labels for sections as opposed to a set of principles.
Sorry.
Oh, I see. So you're saying those are 5 classes of things that should be designated sections? Or some of those should be and some of those should not be?
This was sort of my just like you did straw man for the designated sections, I was trying to do straw man for what the principles are. So what I was thinking is,
okay.
How so you're looking at a module, right? We're trying to be big bucket, big ticket items. If that big ticket item, if we're yes to all 5 of these, you're like, well, that's a designated section. If you're no to all 5 of them, then it's it's not. And so then just like we do criteria for test capability, it seems like a scoring mechanism. Thank you. That makes things clear.
Yeah, because some of these were this should be, and some of these, yeah. Okay.
That makes way more sense to me. So I would start with a sort of meta principle, which is that, let's acknowledge that the thing that we're doing right now has to create a balance between the commercial ecosystem and the community ecosystem. That it is a goal for both at the board and the TC and in the community to have community contribution to a common code base that is good for OpenStack and good for users. It is also a goal to have a healthy commercial ecosystem because that is also good for OpenStack and good for users. And it is what motivates the vendors to invest in the community. So if we start with that as an agreement, that we have to balance.
That's tricky because I think a lot of people would argue that requiring 100% of code to be upstreamed, or at least attempted to be upstreamed, is completely compatible with that.
Well, there's no evidence to suggest that. I mean, if you can name 3 companies that have successfully built billion-dollar businesses on the GPL, then I would love to hear about it because I would use that argument in conversations I have to have all the time. But
if that was our objective, I would say that we should have used the GPL.
Yeah, I mean, I think that decision was made.
It's to second guess our choice of the license since we did not choose the license. In fact, a small group of people chose it at Rackspace.
I chose
before
it.
Many of us got involved in the project.
The first code that was released under Apache license was mine, and I chose it because I thought it was a good idea. So yeah, you're right. It is disingenuous. The community did not choose the license, but the community coalesced around the license that we chose. So, and the reason that
Dell wouldn't have come in if it wasn't Apache.
Well, and NASA never would have been able to participate if it wasn't Apache or something NOSA compliant, which I don't even want to talk about. So the reality is the way the bylaws of the foundation were set up were deliberately to balance a commercial ecosystem and a community ecosystem, and that's why we have separate uses of the mark.
And
the designated section piece is
You're going to go same place I am. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say the purpose with the designated sections is actually to create some balance between Apache do whatever you want and GPL you must upstream everything. And so this is I think in my mind a very deliberate attempt to try and find some balance between helping people upstream and requiring people to upstream. And so Josh's statement, I think, lines up with that.
I think that's all well and good, and I don't want to distract from this too much, but since the topic has come up, I mean, we're not actually talking about changing the license. The license is what it is. It's an Apache license, which means that you can, by and large, do whatever you want with the code, but that doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you do with the code should, in the end, be called OpenStack. And I think that's what, how a lot of us are reacting here, and that, the freedom to do this already exists, but whether or not that should be called OpenStack is the open question.
Right.
Well, but it was an open question, which is sort of the, as far as the community discussion, the process, the proposal to the board vote, and then moving forward on setting up the process to do it. That, took us a year and a half, but it was largely resolved last November unanimously at the board level that the designated sections concept is agreed upon. So this is a GPL-esque aspect of the use of the OpenStack mark. What we're trying to determine, or what this joint effort is how broad sweeping is that? In the sense of is it 100% of the code in one project because the PTL of that code feels like that would be the best thing and they care about GPL, or is it zero code in other projects because they feel that the opportunity for a commercial ecosystem for that particular piece of infrastructure as a service is part of what will keep OpenStack healthy.
not sure it's a good idea to pick and choose how much we do per project based on where we think people might want to have a commercial play. And we can't necessarily anticipate future commercial ideas. So it seems like we should be looking at each project and picking what parts of it are actually usefully replaceable right now. And whether or not somebody goes and decides to build a business around that, or whether that cuts out somebody who has decided to build a business around something that we think is critical. We should, I'm not sure how much we should put, how much we should weigh that.
I agree, because I think there's a technical aspect. And the best one the best stupid example I can think of, and granted both of these are in tree, but HP is running its public cloud on KVM and Rackspace is running its public cloud on Zen. Now, is that interface perfect? No. Like, there's really weird stuff that happens because Rackspace is running on Zen, and I'd like to punch somebody because of that. But in general, the difference in choice that they've each made as a deployer there, I don't think makes either of those clouds more or less OpenStack, right? Like, that's a choice point that's an actually natural choice point, and I think that one's a reasonably obvious one, and so from the technical perspective, I think, sort of to Doug's point, if there's actual choice points that make sense that mostly don't impact the user's thing, and I think that we could consider some of the stuff in the vert layer separation to be bugs rather than whatever, then we can make that in technical rather than saying somebody might want to commercialize this in the future, so let's not step on their toes. I think that the business guys could do a pretty good job of standing up for themselves, as long as we're not like overreaching or making it overly hard.
But this is to me the reason to have multiple principles. We're not trying to say if somebody wants to commercialize it, sorry, you guys have to make it non-designated. What we're trying to do is give the community some guidance when they look at a module or a piece of, a block of code, to say, you know what, I understand that this one's shades of gray, this one's black and white. That all we're trying to do is give people guidance so that it doesn't end up being somebody standing in one corner shouting it is, and somebody on the other standing in another corner shouting it isn't. And because that is not productive. If we can agree to some general guidelines where people can say yes, yes, no, no, and then we can argue about it, bring other people in, it's much easier to moderate those positions. That's all we're trying to do, not to create this acid test for a designated section.
I mean, let's turn it around in the reverse. The reason to have a set of principles at all is not because we really need a lot of guidance in putting these together, but it's because we need something we can point at later when we have inevitable debate about why and how certain sections were designated. We can point back and say, well, these are the principles we applied and this is the decision we came to. We had to do the same thing with gold member membership at the board level. And the first batch of gold member applicants came in before we had written out the gold member selection criteria. And it was a nightmare because whether we said yes or no, we were going to be in a position where we were scrutinized and we had no defensive criteria. We ended up deferring decision, running around and writing criteria, and then coming back to the decision, even though we had a good sense that we could have had a unanimous decision in the first place.
Sorry, I don't think we're arguing. I'm certainly not arguing that we shouldn't have principles. I think I was arguing about how much weight to attach to number 4 in which direction. And I would rather look at the intent of the developers who have contributed code and whether or not they expect a piece of code to be replaced by someone for whatever purpose, rather than, and I understand that the business concerns of the community fall into this too, but placing more weight on the intent of the original developers rather than current or future vendors who may or may not be contributing code.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
I could
and especially, especially from the TC-PTL point of view, because that's the thing.
Is that captured? Okay.
I guess actually that leads me to a related point. Yeah, point 5 I think looks really good, which is that the vendor community, and this is one of those gray areas in role that I find really challenging to talk about. The developers that are in the room at the Design Summit that have the best relationship with the TC, in a lot of cases are not in a product management role inside their parent organization. And so the folks that are doing product management don't have the same visibility into what the TC's plans are for the future. And so we end up with odd circumstances. Well, here's a classic example, is scaling out code in Nova. Is it about cells? Is it about regions and AZs? Is it about host aggregates? What's the future-looking plan for scale-out? Because there are tests and there are APIs, and there are people using those in many different ways, in many different contexts, and vendors have deployed them in all sorts of scenarios. And on the DefCore side, we don't know what the TC's forward-looking plan is as far as how should OpenStack clouds be scaled in the future, what's it going to look like in Juno. And so having designated sections around code that maybe is not long for this world also gets problematic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It came up for me thinking about the developer intent, because the original sort of AZ-based code in Nova, when we wrote it, our developer intent was we're copying the AWS API, not that we really thought about what is this going to mean in the future.
Yeah.
Right. Well, this may feed back into some of those developer discussions too, because just because people are not in this meeting doesn't mean they're not interested in these questions. So if we have these set of principles and we say, think about what you're doing when you design something and what parts of it you expect someone to be able to replace, we're going to end up with better designs anyway, but we'll also have a clearer path as we add new features for selecting what's designated and what's not.
Yeah, it's very true.
I'm also not trying to be done. The goal of this meeting was to make some progress, and so that we can then circulate this back on the list or have a follow-up meeting when people can digest it and sleep on it.
Well, heck, I think just the change to those edits to the for principles section seemed like great forward progress in terms of everybody understanding each other's points of view and clarification today, at least to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think having those principles and starting the process of declaring the designated sections based on those will help us with the thing that I'm most worried about, which is some kind of consistency, some sort of overriding theme as we go through each of the different projects.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, are there any additional edits that people want to make before we move off of this subject, or changes based on what they're reading?
On the principal side?
Yeah. What I would ask is, actually I'll add this to the bottom, that we set a date by which we say the principles will be official. I would love to see the TC actually have a vote or something and make it an official TC guidance. Some screening process. A date just crystallizes things. It forces people to pay attention. And if that's a summit, summit. It doesn't matter to me. It's just some specific date.
I think it's most helpful because it will have another set of TC elections at some point, and then the new members will need to come up to speed.
We get new TC members up to speed by beating them.
Yes, that's true. Beating also works.
The beatings had stopped?
Well, morale improved. Sorry. Too soon?
When I was in one of the other meetings where we were discussing this, a 331 date came up, and I can't remember the context of that. Was that for the capabilities spreadsheet?
Yeah, I think that's capabilities and criteria to be done enough that we can present them at the board meeting on the 4th.
Okay.
That was Troy Tillman's date for remapping.
Okay. I think I put that date in the email thread erroneously, so I can correct that.
So I guess
everybody date-wise, though.
The only other piece I wanted to bring up, because I'm a little confused about it, and maybe Rob, you can help me with this. I'm looking at specifically the glance designated sections proposed by Mark Wash, and the Swift file system and HTTP stores as designated. I agree that improvements to that code should be in the common code base, so I'm not suggesting they should be not designated, but I think what we need to emphasize is designated sections only apply when they are enabling capabilities that are must-have. In other words, if the Swift store for glance is not a must-have capability, or if there's some capability that if there isn't a capability that only that store demonstrates, the code is not guaranteed to be in products that meet the core definition. It's simply that if they're exposing the Swift capability, they need to be using that code.
I'm not
familiar
with that piece of Swift of glance. Are those 3 different versions of something that can be swapped in and out to do the same thing?
Yes.